Three identical pairs of blue eyes watched as their father walked back to his luxury SUV without looking back. Thomas Anderson's expensive shoes kicked up small clouds of dust in the Arizona desert as he retreated, leaving his 3-year-old triplet daughters standing alone in the scorching heat. "Daddy," Olivia called out, her small voice trembling. Emma began to cry, her pink dress already darkened with sweat. Sophie simply stared, too shocked to speak. Inside the vehicle, Guardian, their German shepherd, had been watching intently. As Thomas started the engine, the dog's muscles tensed. The moment before the SUV pulled away, Guardian lunged forward, squeezing through the barely open window with military-trained precision. Thomas floored the accelerator, the SUV disappearing in a cloud of dust, leaving behind 3 abandoned children and 1 determined dog standing protectively before them. What happened next would change all their lives forever. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The desert heat bore down mercilessly as the cloud of dust from Thomas's SUV faded into the horizon. It was high noon in July, the temperature already climbing past 108 degrees. Not a single cloud offered relief from the relentless Arizona sun. The triplets stood frozen in shock, their identical blonde hair shimmering in the sunlight. Emma's sobs grew louder, her small shoulders shaking beneath her pink cotton dress. Sophie, the youngest by 3 minutes, clutched her yellow sundress as though it might somehow protect her. Olivia, always the leader despite being only 3 years old, attempted to comfort her sisters, though her own blue eyes brimmed with tears. "It's okay," she whispered, not believing her own words. "Daddy will come back." Guardian surveyed their surroundings, his military training evident in his alert posture. His amber eyes scanned the barren landscape, nothing but sand, scattered rocks, and saguaro cacti stretching for miles. His keen senses detected no water source nearby, no shelter from the deadly heat. The German shepherd understood what the children couldn't. They had perhaps 24 hours before dehydration became life-threatening. The girls' delicate skin was already reddening under the harsh sun. Their small white sandals offered little protection against the scorching sand, which had reached a blistering 140 degrees, hot enough to cause serious burns within seconds of direct contact. Guardian nudged Olivia's hand with his nose, then moved toward a small rock formation about 50 yards away. He barked once, then returned to herd the children like the working dog he had been trained to be. "I think he wants us to follow him," Olivia said, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. Emma's crying quieted slightly as she reached for Guardian's familiar fur. "Good doggy," she whispered. The shepherd patiently guided the triplets, staying close as their tiny legs struggled through the sand. When Sophie stumbled, Guardian was instantly at her side, offering his sturdy body for support. The girls' breathing had already become labored in the dry heat, their lips beginning to crack from dehydration. They reached the rocks just as Sophie's legs gave out. The formation created a small area of shade, not much, but enough to shield the children from direct sunlight. Guardian positioned himself at the edge of the shade, his body blocking the worst of the heat while remaining vigilant. "I'm thirsty," Emma whimpered, her voice already hoarse. Olivia looked around desperately, as though water might materialize from the air. "Maybe Daddy will bring some soon." Guardian's ears perked up, catching sounds far beyond human hearing. Something moved in the distance, not Thomas returning, but the subtle shifting of a predator. The shepherd's muscles tensed as he positioned himself between the potential threat and his charges. In the unforgiving desert, the clock had started ticking. Survival experts estimate that small children can last less than 2 days in such conditions without water. As the heat shimmered across the sand, creating dancing mirages on the horizon, Guardian understood their time was already running out. Thomas Anderson hadn't always been the kind of man who would abandon his children in the desert. 5 years earlier, he had been the golden boy of Phoenix real estate development, with a corner office overlooking the city he was helping to build. His projects transformed neglected neighborhoods into thriving communities, and his reputation for honest business practices made him a respected figure in local circles. It was at a charity gala that he first met Caroline Mitchell, a pediatric surgeon with laughing blue eyes and a passion for healing children. Despite their demanding careers, they fell deeply in love. Marrying within a year, they purchased a Spanish-style home in an exclusive neighborhood, filling it with dreams of the family they would create together. When Caroline announced her pregnancy, Thomas was overjoyed. When the ultrasound revealed triplets, he was overwhelmed but determined to be the father his own had never been. He converted the guest wing into a nursery painted in soft pastels, with 3 identical cribs awaiting the miracle of their daughters. "They'll never want for anything," he promised Carolyn as they lay in bed, his hand resting on her growing belly. "I'll give them the world." But the world had other plans. Carolyn's pregnancy became high risk in the 3rd trimester. Complications mounted, requiring her to be hospitalized weeks before her due date. Despite the best medical care, the delivery became a nightmare of alarms and urgent medical orders. Thomas remembered that day in fragments the joy of hearing his daughter's first cries, followed by the horror of Caroline's hemorrhage. Her last words to him had been about the girls. "Take care of our daughters," she had whispered, her hand squeezing his with surprising strength. "Promise me they'll know how much I love them." Hours later, she was gone, leaving Thomas with 3 perfect, healthy babies and a chasm of grief that seemed impossible to bridge. It was during those darkest days that Guardian entered their lives. The German Shepherd had been a military service dog, trained for detection and protection in Afghanistan, injured during his last deployment. He had been retired and was struggling to adjust to civilian life. Thomas's brother, a veteran himself, suggested the dog might provide both protection for the new family and a purpose for the struggling animal. Their connection was immediate. Guardian, sensing the broken man before him, pressed his head against Thomas's leg as if to say, "I understand loss too." That night, the shepherd slept beside the triplets' cribs, a silent sentinel protecting what remained of Thomas's heart. As the months passed, Thomas threw himself into being both mother and father to his daughters. He learned to braid hair, kiss scraped knees, and check for monsters under the bed. Guardian became his partner in parenting, watching over the girls with a devotion that sometimes brought tears to Thomas's eyes. By the time Olivia, Emma, and Sophie turned 2, they had developed distinct personalities despite their identical appearance. Olivia was the natural leader, always first to try new things. Emma was the sensitive one, quick to laugh but also quick to tears. Sophie was the observer, taking everything in with thoughtful silence before making up her mind. All 3 adored Guardian. They climbed over him like a living playground, braided ribbons into his fur, and fell asleep against his warm body during movie nights. The shepherd bore their attention with patience, seeming to understand that these small humans needed his protection more than anyone he had guarded before. But beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect life, Thomas was drowning. Medical bills from Caroline's final weeks had depleted their savings. Several development projects failed as the economy shifted, leaving him overextended. He began making desperate financial decisions, taking risks he would have once considered unthinkable. Just one more deal, he told himself late at night, reviewing figures that never balanced. One big win to set things right. That search for a quick solution led him to Victor Blackwell, a private lender who offered to finance Thomas's most ambitious project yet. The interest rates were exorbitant, but Thomas convinced himself he could make it work. He didn't look too closely at where Blackwell's money came from, or question why the man seemed so interested in his family. As his financial situation deteriorated, Thomas began spending less time at home. The girls noticed his absence, asking questions he couldn't answer truthfully. Guardian noticed, too, watching Thomas with knowing eyes that seemed to see through his facade of normalcy. "Daddy sad?" Sophie had asked one night, climbing into his lap with a children's book. "No, sweetheart. Daddy's just busy." He'd lied, holding her close and breathing in the sweet scent of her hair. But Guardian knew better. The shepherd would follow Thomas as he paced the house after the girls were asleep, watching as he made late-night phone calls and drank too much whiskey. Sometimes, Thomas would bury his face in the dog's fur and weep, releasing the emotions he couldn't show his daughters. 60 miles away from Thomas's suburban home, Martha Johnson tended her small garden as the sun rose over the desert. At 65, her face was a road map of lines earned through a life connected to this harsh landscape. Her small adobe house sat on the edge of the Sonoran Desert, the last outpost before civilization gave way to an ancient wilderness. Martha was known in the nearby town as a keeper of traditions, half Navajo on her mother's side. She had grown up learning the old ways, reading the signs of nature, understanding the desert's rhythms, respecting its power. Some locals dismissed her as eccentric, but many sought her wisdom when modern solutions failed. She hadn't spoken to her daughter Caroline in over 20 years, not since the girl had left for medical school, rejecting her heritage for what she called real science. The news of Caroline's death had reached Martha through a distant acquaintance. Too late for her to attend the funeral. She had mourned alone, performing the traditional ceremonies to guide her daughter's spirit. She didn't know she had grandchildren, 3 little girls who shared her daughter's eyes. That morning, as Martha gathered herbs before the heat became unbearable, she felt an uneasiness she couldn't explain. The desert birds were flying in unusual patterns, and her old bones ached with a warning she had learned never to ignore. "Something's coming," she murmured to herself, looking out across the shimmering landscape. "Something important." The night before Thomas abandoned his daughters, Guardian had been unusually restless. He paced the hallways of their home, pausing to check on each sleeping child before returning to Thomas's bedroom door with a low whine. Thomas sat at his desk, staring at photos of his family, Caroline holding their newborn daughters, the girl's 3rd birthday celebration just 2 weeks earlier. Guardian patiently wearing a party hat as the triplets blew out their candles. Beside these happy images lay a more ominous document, explicit threats from Blackwell's associates detailing exactly what would happen if Thomas failed to pay his debt. Guardian nudged Thomas's hand, sensing his despair. "What am I going to do?" boy," Thomas whispered, scratching behind the shepherd's ears. "What would Caroline tell me to do?" The dog's amber eyes seemed to hold an ancient wisdom, but of course, no answers came. As dawn broke, Thomas made a decision that would haunt him forever, one that would test Guardian's loyalty in ways neither of them could imagine. Guardian limped across the baking sand, ignoring the pain in his left front paw. The rattlesnake's venom had not been enough to kill him. But the bite throbbed with each step. Still, he pressed forward, his acute senses leading him toward something the human nose could never detect from this distance water. The triplets followed slowly behind, their energy depleted after hours in the punishing heat. Olivia held Emma's hand while Sophie trailed a few steps behind, her yellow dress now dust-covered and damp with sweat. They had stopped crying, which Guardian knew was not a good sign. Children should cry when they're afraid. When they stop, it means something worse. Resignation. "Guardian is hurt," Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible over the desert wind. "He's taking us somewhere," Olivia replied with the unwavering faith of a child. "He knows what to do." The German shepherd paused, turning to make sure his charges were still following. His military training had prepared him for harsh environments, but the children had no such preparation. Their fair skin was angry red despite the shade he had found for them earlier. Their lips cracked from dehydration. If they didn't find water soon. Guardian refused to complete the thought. He had one mission now: keep these children alive. He had failed to protect them from their father's decision, but he would not fail them again. His sensitive ears picked up a subtle change in the desert soundtrack, the faint buzz of insects that suggested moisture. He quickened his pace despite the pain, leading the girls toward a cluster of rocks that looked no different from countless others they had passed. But Guardian knew better. The desert held secrets visible only to those who understood its language. 30 miles away, Martha Johnson loaded supplies into her ancient pickup truck. A canteen of water, dried fruit, a medical kit, and a handmade blanket woven in the traditional patterns of her ancestors. The uneasiness that had plagued her since dawn had crystallized into certainty. Someone needed help in the desert, and the authorities weren't going to provide it. "Mrs. Johnson, you can't seriously be heading out there," Sheriff Miller said, leaning against his patrol car outside the small grocery store where Martha had stopped for final supplies. Frank Miller had known Martha for 30 years, respected her knowledge of the desert, but drew the line at what he called her feelings. 3 children, Frank, identical, like raindrops. She replied, securing her supplies in the truck bed. "Been seeing them in my mind since sunrise." The sheriff sighed, removing his hat to wipe sweat from his brow. "Martha, we have no reports of missing children, not in our county, not in any surrounding counties. I can't spare deputies to chase visions." "Not asking you to come," Martha said simply. "Just telling you where I'm headed, case I don't come back." Something in her tone made Sheriff Miller straighten up. In all the years he'd known Martha Johnson, he'd never known her to be wrong about the desert's warnings. "You take your satellite phone at least," he conceded, "and check in every 3 hours." Martha nodded, climbing into her truck with the spryness of a much younger woman. "If I find something, you'll be the first to know." As her truck disappeared down the dusty road, Sheriff Miller shook his head. "Crazy old woman," he muttered, though without conviction. Back in Phoenix, Detective Sarah Reynolds surveyed Thomas Anderson's empty apartment with a growing sense of unease. The call had come in that morning, a cleaner arriving to find the door unlocked, the place seemingly abandoned, though nothing appeared to be stolen. "What do we know about the resident?" she asked the uniformed officer taking notes beside her. "Thomas Anderson, 38, real estate developer, widower with 3 young daughters, identical triplets." The officer read from his notepad. "Neighbors say they haven't seen him or the kid since yesterday morning. His car's not in the garage." Sarah moved through the silent rooms, noting the expensive furniture covered in a fine layer of dust. In the kitchen, dishes sat unwashed in the sink, 3 small pink cups, each with a different princess adorning the side. 3 little plates with half-eaten toast. "Where are the children's rooms?" she asked. The officer led her down a hallway to a large bedroom painted in soft pastels. 3 small beds with identical comforters. A bookshelf filled with children's stories. A toy chest overflowing with dolls and stuffed animals. Everything neat, orderly, well cared for. Sarah's eye caught something partially hidden beneath one of the beds, a dog's chew toy, well worn and clearly loved. "Does he have a dog?" she asked. The officer checked his notes. "German Shepherd, according to the neighbor. Always with the family." Sarah nodded slowly. A picture forming in her mind, not a happy one. In 15 years of detective work, she'd learned that when a parent disappears with their children suddenly, leaving behind a home that shows no signs of planned departure, the outcomes were rarely positive. "I want an APB on Thomas Anderson's vehicle. Check traffic cameras, toll booths, gas stations," she ordered, her voice tight. "And get me everything you can on his background finances, relationships, any custody disputes, though the report says he's a widower." As the officer hurried to comply, Sarah stood in the doorway of the children's room, a sense of dread settling in her stomach. "Where did you take them, Thomas?" she whispered to the empty house. "Back in the desert." Guardian had led the triplets to a small depression between 2 large boulders. Here, sheltered from the wind that had begun to pick up as afternoon stretched toward evening, a tiny spring bubbled up from beneath the earth, barely more than a trickle, but enough. Guardian barked once, pointing with his muzzle toward the moisture. Olivia gasped, understanding immediately. She helped her sisters kneel beside the small pool of water that had formed, showing them how to cup their tiny hands to drink. "Slowly," she cautioned, remembering what their father had taught them during a hiking trip the previous year. "Little sips." Guardian watched protectively as the girls drank, their parched bodies absorbing the life-giving moisture. Only when they had finished did he lower his own muzzle to the water, lapping quickly but efficiently. The water revived the children somewhat, bringing color back to their faces and energy to their movements. Emma even managed a small smile as she patted Guardian's head. "Good boy," she said, her voice stronger than it had been hours earlier. "The best boy." Guardian accepted the praise with dignity, but his attention had already shifted to their next challenge. The sun would set within hours, bringing a dangerous drop in temperature. The desert nights could be as deadly as its days, especially for small children with no proper clothing or shelter. He needed to find them better protection before darkness fell. Miles away, Martha Johnson had stopped her truck at the edge of a narrow canyon. her eyes fixed on something the average observer would have missed entirely, a cluster of birds circling in an unnatural pattern. "Desert's trying to tell me something," she murmured, retrieving binoculars from her glove compartment. Through the magnified lenses, she could see ravens gathered near a rocky outcropping, their behavior indicating curiosity rather than the discovery of carrion. Something or someone was disturbing the natural rhythm of this place. Martha checked her satellite phone, considering whether to call Sheriff Miller. No, she decided, not yet. Not until she had something concrete to report beyond birds and feelings. She grabbed her walking stick and supply pack, locked her truck, and began the careful descent into the canyon. The terrain was treacherous, loose rocks sliding beneath her experienced feet. But Martha moved with the confidence of someone who had navigated this landscape for decades. Halfway down, she paused, eyes narrowing at something caught on a thorny bush, a small piece of fabric, pink with white polka dots. Martha carefully retrieved it, rubbing the material between weathered fingers. "Child's clothing," she confirmed to herself, tucking the scrap into her pocket. Her vision of 3 identical children no longer seemed like mere intuition. As the afternoon waned, Sheriff Miller received a call from Detective Reynolds in Phoenix. "We've got a situation," Sarah explained, her voice tense. "Thomas Anderson withdrew all his available cash yesterday morning, nearly $20,000. His last cell signal pinged near the western edge of the Sonoran Desert before going dark. And we've found some concerning communications on his home computer threats from someone named Blackwell." The sheriff's thoughts immediately went to Martha Johnson and her insistence about children in the desert. "Any chance Anderson has 3 young daughters?" he asked, "identical triplets?" There was a pause on the line. "How did you know that?" Sarah asked. "Get a search helicopter in the air," Sheriff Miller ordered, already reaching for his keys. "And send a patrol to the western quadrant of the Sonoran. I think I may know someone who can help us." But by the time he reached Martha's house, she was already gone. Her truck nowhere in sight. And the satellite phone she had promised to keep on it sat on her kitchen table, forgotten in her haste. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Guardian led the triplets away from the small spring, toward a series of rock formations he had spotted in the distance. His instincts told him they might provide better shelter for the night ahead. The girls followed trustingly, their small bodies revived somewhat by the water, but still dangerously vulnerable to the elements. Guardian kept the pace slow, aware of their limitations, stopping frequently to let them rest. "Where's Daddy?" Emma asked during one such rest. The question they had all been avoiding. Olivia and Sophie exchanged glances, neither wanting to voice their fears. "He'll find us," Olivia said finally, with a confidence she didn't feel. "Or Guardian will take care of us until he does." At the sound of his name, the shepherd turned, his amber eyes meeting Olivia's. In that moment, a silent communication passed between them, a promise from Guardian that he would not abandon them as their father had. What none of them knew was that, at that very moment, Thomas Anderson was sitting in a dingy motel room 50 miles away, a loaded gun on the table before him, contemplating what he had done and what he would do next to save his daughters from the consequences of his mistakes. Thomas Anderson stared at the gun on the motel table, his reflection distorted in its polished surface. The weight of what he had done crushed down on him like a physical force. The memory of his daughter's confused faces as he walked away from them replayed endlessly in his mind, their voices calling, "Daddy," echoing in his ears. He picked up his burner phone and scrolled through the messages that had driven him to the unthinkable. The most recent one, sent just 12 hours ago, contained a photo of his daughters sleeping in their beds, taken from inside their home. The message below it was simple: debt must be paid, their lives or desert drop. Your choice. No police. Thomas hadn't slept in 3 days, not since Victor Blackwell's men had cornered him in the parking garage beneath his office building. The memory of that encounter made his hands shake as he poured another finger of whiskey from the cheap bottle he'd purchased at a gas station. "You've got a choice, Anderson," the taller of the two men had said, his voice conversational despite the gun pressed against Thomas's ribs. "Pay the $2 million you owe by Friday, or we take payment another way. Blackwell's particularly interested in those pretty little girls of yours. Lots of sick people willing to pay for kids like that. Identical triplets. That's a premium product." Thomas had vomited right there in the garage, earning him a disgusted shove against the concrete wall. "Or," the second man had added, "you can handle it yourself. Drive them out to the western desert. Leave them there. We'll consider the debt paid. Their odds aren't good, but better than what Blackwell has planned." "You're asking me to kill my own children," Thomas had whispered. The first man had shrugged. "Calling it a mercy killing wouldn't be wrong. Besides, maybe someone finds them. Slim chance, but not zero. With us, zero chance they ever see sunlight again. Ever." Thomas had spent the next 2 days frantically trying to raise the money, calling in every favor, offering everything he owned. But his credit was shot, his reputation in tatters, and no legitimate bank would touch him. He'd even gone to the police, only to leave without filing a report when the detective mentioned bringing in his daughters to protective services just to be safe. The thought of his girls in foster care, separated from each other, had been unbearable, but not as unbearable as imagining them in the hands of Blackwell's human trafficking network. So he had made his choice. The desert. At least there. They had Guardian. The German Shepherd had been a last, desperate element of Thomas's plan. He knew the dog's training, his protective instincts, his almost supernatural bond with the girls. If anyone could keep them alive until help arrived, it was Guardian. Thomas had even forgotten to close the window fully, praying that the dog would follow when he realized what was happening. Now. Thomas drained his whiskey and tucked the gun into his waistband. He wouldn't be using it on himself, not yet. First, he would make sure Blackwell and his men could never threaten another child again. In the desert. Guardian had led the triplets to a shallow cave formed by a massive boulder resting against a sandstone wall. It wasn't deep, but it provided shelter from the wind that had begun to pick up as the sun set. More importantly, it would help them retain body heat during the dangerously cold desert night. The shepherd's leg had swollen from the snakebite, making each step painful, but he gave no indication of distress as he carefully inspected their shelter. His military training had included searching for IEDs and other dangers. Now he applied those same skills to ensure no scorpions or snakes had taken residence in their temporary haven. Satisfied the space was safe, he herded the girls inside, positioning himself at the entrance where he could keep watch while still providing them with warmth. Olivia, displaying wisdom beyond her 3 years, gathered small rocks and arranged them in a circle as she had seen her father do during their camping trip the previous summer. "We need a fire," she explained to her sisters, though she had no means to create one. Emma sat down heavily, exhaustion evident in her slumped shoulders. "I'm cold," she said, her teeth beginning to chatter as the temperature dropped with alarming speed. Sophie, the quietest of the three, had been watching Guardian intently. Now she approached him, placing her small hand on his injured leg. "Guardian's hurt," she announced solemnly. The shepherd allowed the gentle touch, though the area was painfully tender. In his years of military service, he had learned to compartmentalize pain, to continue functioning despite injury. But the venom was working against that training, making him lethargic and sending waves of fire through his veins. Olivia joined her sister, examining the wound with the serious expression of a child imitating adults. "Daddy showed me about snake bites," she said. "You have to keep it clean and rest." Guardian understood none of the words, but the gentle hands communicated concern. He licked Olivia's cheek once, then turned his attention back to the darkening desert beyond their shelter. Rest was a luxury he could not afford, not with night predators beginning to stir, 50 miles away. Martha Johnson navigated the treacherous terrain with the sure-footedness of someone born to the desert. The scrap of pink fabric had energized her, confirming her intuition. She moved with purpose now, following signs invisible to the untrained eye, subtle disturbances in the sand, broken twigs on the sparse vegetation, the behavior of local wildlife. As darkness fell, she reluctantly made camp, knowing that continuing without light would be dangerous even for her. She built a small fire, its flames casting dancing shadows against the canyon walls. After a simple meal of jerky and dried fruit, she wrapped herself in her blanket and stared up at the star-filled sky. "Caroline," she whispered to her long-dead daughter, "if your children are out there, help me find them." The desert provided no answer beyond the whisper of wind through ancient stones. In Phoenix, Detective Sarah Reynolds had assembled a task force in record time, galvanized by the discovery of Thomas Anderson's financial connections to Victor Blackwell, a suspected human trafficker the department had been building a case against for months. We believe Anderson's daughters, Olivia, Emma, and Sophie, age 3, may have been abandoned in the western sector of the Sonoran Desert. She briefed the assembled officers. Anderson's vehicle was captured on a traffic camera heading west on Highway 60 yesterday morning, but we've had no sign of him or the children since. She pinned photos of the triplets to the board, 3 identical little girls with blonde hair and blue eyes, smiling at the camera in matching Christmas dresses. Next to them, she placed a photo of Guardian, the German shepherd who had also gone missing. "This is the family dog, a retired military service animal, trained in protection and tracking. He may be with the children, which could improve their chances significantly." Sheriff Miller, who had joined the task force upon learning of the connection to Martha's vision, raised his hand. "We have a local resident, Martha Johnson, who reported sensing children in distress in the Western Canyon region early this morning. She's experienced in desert survival and knows the terrain better than anyone. She's already out there searching, though we've lost contact with her." As several officers exchanged skeptical glances at the mention of sensing children, but Sarah ignored them. "We'll coordinate search patterns with Sheriff Miller's team," she decided, Helicopter surveillance begins at first light. Until then, we'll establish a perimeter and prepare ground teams. As the meeting broke up, Sheriff Miller approached Sarah privately. "There's something else you should know," he said quietly. "Martha Johnson's full name is Martha Johnson Mitchell. She changed it back after her divorce. Her daughter was Caroline Mitchell." Sarah's eyes widened as she made the connection. Caroline Mitchell Anderson, Thomas's late wife. The sheriff nodded grimly. "Martha has no idea her grandchildren are out there. She's never even met them. Caroline cut ties with her mother years ago. So we have a grandmother searching for grandchildren she doesn't know exist," Sarah murmured. "This just keeps getting more complicated." Night had fully descended on the desert, transforming the scorching landscape into a freezing wasteland. Inside their shallow cave, the triplets huddled together for warmth, their small bodies shivering despite Guardian's presence beside them. "I'm scared," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible over the howling wind that had picked up strength as darkness fell. "Remember what Daddy taught us," Olivia said, trying to sound brave. "When you're scared, count stars." The three little girls tilted their heads toward the cave entrance, where a patch of night sky remained visible. They began counting together, their voices a soft counterpoint to the desert's nocturnal sounds. 1, 2, 3. Guardian's ears suddenly pricked forward, his body tensing. Something was moving out there, beyond the reach of human senses, but clear to his acute hearing. The shepherd rose silently, ignoring the pain in his leg, and moved to the cave entrance. "A guardian," Sophie called softly, noticing his change in posture. The dog gave no indication he'd heard, his attention fixed on the darkness. A low growl began deep in his chest as his eyes picked out shapes moving in the night coyotes. A small pack of 3 or 4, drawn perhaps by the scent of his blood from the snake wound, in his prime. Guardian could have taken on the pack without hesitation. Now, weakened by venom and dehydration, he was less certain of the outcome. But there was no question of what he would do. These children were his to protect, a responsibility that went beyond training, beyond human commands. As the first coyote appeared at the edge of visibility, eyes gleaming in the starlight, Guardian moved away from the cave entrance, drawing the predator's attention away from the children. His posture communicated challenge, a clear message to the wild canids to reach the cave. They would have to go through him first. In the motel room, Thomas Anderson prepared for war with the cold precision of a man with nothing left to lose. He disassembled his gun, cleaned each part methodically, then reassembled it with practiced hands. Carolyn's father had been a gun enthusiast, insisting on teaching Thomas proper handling even though Thomas had never shown interest in firearms. "Thank you, Edward," he whispered to his long-dead father-in-law as he checked the ammunition one final time. Beside the weapon lay the results of his day's intelligence-gathering property records, showing a warehouse owned by one of Blackwell's shell companies. Surveillance photos Thomas had taken himself of men coming and going. A hand-drawn map of the interior based on building permits filed with the city. Thomas was no hero. He had never served in the military, never been in a real fight, never shot anything more threatening than a paper target. But he was a father who had committed the unforgivable, and he would rather die trying to make it right than live with what he had done. He tucked the gun into a shoulder holster hidden beneath his jacket, pocketed the extra ammunition, and picked up his car keys. Tomorrow, Blackwell's operation would end, one way or another. Tonight, he would make sure the authorities had everything they needed to find his daughters, whether he survived or not. He opened his laptop and composed a detailed email to Detective Reynolds, including everything he knew about Blackwell, the threats against his daughters, and most importantly, the exact location where he had left the girls in the desert. He set the email to send automatically in 8 hours, enough time for him to confront Blackwell, but not so long that it would further endanger his children if he failed. "I'm so sorry. My angels," he whispered, looking at the photo of his daughters he kept in his wallet. "Daddy made a terrible mistake, but Guardian will keep you safe until help comes." As he walked to his car, Thomas was unaware that 2 men watched from a sedan parked across the street Blackwell's insurance policy, making sure Thomas followed through on their agreement. "He's on the move," one said into a cell phone. "Doesn't look like he's heading back to the desert. Want us to intercept?" The voice that answered belonged to Victor Blackwell himself. "No. Follow him. If he's going to the police, take him out. Otherwise, let's see what our desperate daddy does next." The men started their engine, prepared to follow Thomas into the night, unaware that they were setting in motion the final act of a tragedy, or perhaps a miracle that had begun the moment Guardian leaped from Thomas's car to stand beside 3 abandoned children in the unforgiving desert. Guardian stood his ground as the coyotes circled, their lean bodies slipping through the shadows like liquid darkness. The pain in his leg had become a distant concern, overridden by the protective instinct that had been both bred and trained into him. In Afghanistan, he had faced worse threats than wild dogs, but never with such precious cargo depending on him. The lead coyote, a battle-scarred male, moved forward with the cautious respect of one predator acknowledging another. Guardian's hackles rose, his teeth bared in a silent warning. The message was clear: proceed at your peril. Inside the shallow cave, Olivia had gathered her sisters closer, one arm around each twin. Though only 3 years old, she sensed the danger outside. "Shh," she whispered, though neither Emma nor Sophie had made a sound. All 3 watched with wide eyes as Guardian's silhouette stood framed against the star-filled desert sky. The standoff lasted several minutes, a silent negotiation between wild and domesticated canids. Finally, the lead coyote turned away, signaling retreat to his pack. Food was plentiful in the desert. No meal was worth challenging the fierce Guardian who smelled of both wolf ancestry and human protection. Guardian remained vigilant until the coyotes had disappeared into the darkness, their yipping calls fading into the night. Only then did he return to the cave, limping more heavily than before. The confrontation had drained his already depleted reserves. Emma reached out as he settled beside them, her small hand gently stroking his fur. "Good boy," she murmured, the simple praise carrying all the love her 3-year-old heart could express. The shepherd leaned into the touch briefly before positioning himself at the cave entrance again, his body creating a living barrier between the children and the dangers outside. He would not sleep tonight. The desert held too many threats, and the venom in his system made rest dangerous. If he slept, he might not wake, miles away. Thomas Anderson pulled his car to the curb 2 blocks from Blackwell's warehouse. He'd noticed the tail following him from the motel and had employed every evasive driving technique he could remember from action movies. eventually losing them in a mall parking garage by switching vehicles with a college student who was all too happy to take $500 and Thomas's luxury SUV for the night. Now, in a battered Honda Civic that smelled of fast food and cigarettes, Thomas observed the warehouse through binoculars. 2 armed guards patrolled the perimeter, not the rent-a-cop variety, but men with the hard eyes and alert posture of those accustomed to violence. Thomas's hands trembled slightly as he set down the binoculars and checked his weapon one final time. He was no hero, no trained operative, just a desperate father with nothing left to lose. His phone buzzed with a text message. Glancing down, he saw it was from an unknown number. "We know you switched cars, last chance to walk away. Go home. Forget your daughters. Live, or join them in a shallow grave." The message was accompanied by a photo that made Thomas's blood run cold, a satellite image of the exact spot where he had left his daughters, marked with a red X. The meaning was clear. Blackwell's men knew where the girls were and could reach them at any time. Thomas started the car's engine, his decision made. He wouldn't be assaulting the warehouse tonight after all. His daughters needed him now, immediately. He would drive through the night, reach the desert by dawn, and pray that Guardian had kept them alive until then. What he didn't know was that 2 separate search efforts were already converging on that same location, racing against time and the desert's merciless conditions. Martha Johnson had risen before dawn, her old bones protesting the hard ground where she'd slept. The desert cold had settled deep in her joints, but she moved with purpose, gathering her supplies and extinguishing the remains of her small fire. She paused, kneeling to press her palm against the earth, a habit she'd developed as a child under her mother's tutelage. "Listen to the land," her mother had taught her. "It speaks to those who know how to hear." The desert told her to hurry. Northwest, toward the ancient canyon where rain sometimes created seasonal waterfalls. Someone waited there. Martha shouldered her pack and began walking, her eyes constantly scanning the terrain for signs. The pink fabric scrap she'd found yesterday was clutched in her hand like a talisman, a tangible connection to the children from her vision. Sheriff Miller's voice crackled over the radio in Detective Sarah Reynolds' SUV as their convoy of search vehicles headed into the desert just after sunrise. "Helicopters spotted something about 12 miles northwest of our position," he reported. "Could be a dog, and what looks like 3 small figures taking shelter in a rock formation." Sarah's heart leaped. "Condition?" "Can't tell from this altitude. Pilot says they're not moving much, which could be good or bad. We're about an hour away by vehicle. Terrain's getting rough." "Any sign of Anderson?" "Negative. But we've got another development. Highway Patrol found his SUV abandoned at a mall in Phoenix last night. He switched vehicles. And Martha Johnson's truck was spotted heading into the Western Canyon early this morning." Sarah processed this information as she navigated the increasingly difficult terrain. "So we have the children's father potentially heading toward them, their estranged grandmother already searching for them, and the children themselves stranded with a dog that may or may not be protecting them." "That about sums it up," Miller agreed. "Plus whatever Blackwell's involvement is in all this. My deputies raided one of his properties last night based on the information you shared. Place was cleaned out, but they found evidence of recent activity." "He's running," Sarah concluded. "Question is, will he try to tie up loose ends before he disappears?" The sheriff's silence was answer enough. Inside the cave, the triplets had finally succumbed to exhaustion, sleeping in a huddled pile like puppies, drawing warmth from each other. Guardian maintained his vigil despite his deteriorating condition. The snake venom was working its way through his system, causing his vision to blur and his breathing to become labored. Still, his ears remained sharp, catching the faint but unmistakable sound of approaching vehicles. Friend or foe? He couldn't determine. But any human presence represented both potential help and potential threat to his charges. With painful effort, Guardian rose to his feet, limped to where the girls slept, and gently nudged Olivia awake. The eldest Triplet blinked up at him, momentarily confused. "Guardian," she murmured, then noticed his alert posture. "What is it, boy?" The shepherd turned his head toward the cave entrance, ears forward, body tense but not aggressive. Someone was coming. Olivia seemed to understand, shaking her sisters awake with surprising gentleness. "Someone's coming," she whispered. "Maybe Daddy." Emma sat up immediately, hope lighting her dehydrated features. "Daddy's coming back." Sophie remained silent, her thoughtful eyes moving from Guardian to the cave entrance. Of the three, she had always been the most intuitive, the one who seemed to understand Guardian best. "Not Daddy," she said finally, with the simple certainty of a child stating an obvious fact. "Someone else." Guardian confirmed her assessment with a soft whine. The approaching vehicles didn't carry the familiar scent of Thomas Anderson. These were strangers, and while they might bring rescue, the shepherd's military training had taught him to trust no one until their intentions were proven. He positioned himself in front of the children, his stance protective but not overtly aggressive. If these newcomers meant harm, they would find him a formidable obstacle despite his injury. If they brought help, he would allow them to approach under his watchful eye. Thomas Anderson drove through the night, pushing the borrowed Honda to its limits on the empty desert highways. His mind raced with scenarios, each more terrifying than the last. Had Blackwell's men already reached his daughters? Was Guardian able to protect them? Were his little girls even still alive after nearly 24 hours in the Sonoran Desert's extreme conditions? "Please," he whispered to whatever power might be listening, "take me instead. Punish me. But spare my daughters." The sun was just cresting the eastern horizon when he turned onto the rough desert track that would take him to the spot where he had committed the unforgivable. The Honda wasn't built for off-road driving, its undercarriage scraping painfully against rocks. But Thomas pushed on, desperation overriding caution. He was still 5 miles from his destination when the car shuddered, coughed, and died, a victim of the punishing terrain. Thomas slammed his hands against the steering wheel in frustration, then grabbed his backpack containing water and his weapon. He would cover the remaining distance on foot, no matter how long it took. As he started walking, he noticed a dust cloud in the distance, vehicles approaching from the northwest, heading toward the same location. Friend or foe? He couldn't tell, but he quickened his pace, ignoring the blisters forming on his feet and the sun already beginning to burn his exposed skin. His daughters needed him. Nothing else mattered. Martha Johnson had been walking for hours, following signs only she could read: a disturbed rock here, a bent cactus spine there, the subtle evidence of passage that most would overlook. The pink fabric scrap had been joined by a second find, a small white sock, child-sized, snagged on a thorny bush. She was close now. The canyon walls rose around her, providing occasional shade from the already intense morning sun. Martha paused to drink sparingly from her canteen, saving most of her water for whoever she might find. The desert was already reclaiming its nighttime coolness, the temperature rising with alarming speed. A sound caught her attention, the distant thrum of helicopter blades. Looking up, she spotted a search helicopter circling about a mile ahead, near a distinctive rock formation she knew well. The Old Woman, locals called it, a boulder that resembled a hunched figure when viewed from the right angle. Martha smiled grimly. Her intuition had been correct. She increased her pace, moving with the energy of someone half her age, drawn forward by certainty and purpose. What she didn't yet realize was that she was walking toward a reunion 65 years in the making with grandchildren she had never known existed. The search convoy had reached a point where the terrain became impassable for standard vehicles. Sheriff Miller and Detective Reynolds, along with 4 deputies and a paramedic, continued on foot, following the helicopter's guidance through their radio. "How much further?" Sarah asked, adjusting her wide-brimmed hat against the morning sun. "About half a mile," Sheriff Miller replied, consulting the GPS on his phone. "Pilot says the dog is now standing at the entrance to a small cave, appears alert but not aggressive." "That's a good sign," the paramedic commented. "If the children were—" He didn't finish the sentence, but everyone understood. If the worst had happened, the dog's behavior would likely be different. Sarah nodded, trying to maintain professional detachment despite the images that kept intruding 3 little girls, alone in this harsh landscape, frightened and suffering. She had nieces about the same age, and the thought of them in such a situation made her stomach clench. "Sheriff," one of the deputies called, pointing southeast. "We've got someone approaching on foot, adult male, moving fast." Miller raised his binoculars. "It's Anderson," he confirmed, his voice hardening. "Sarah, you and 2 deputies continue to the children. Carson and I will intercept Anderson." Sarah wanted to protest Anderson was her case, but the children's welfare took precedence. She nodded sharply and continued toward the rock formation with the paramedic and remaining deputies. As they rounded a bend in the canyon, the helicopter hovered briefly overhead before moving aside, giving them a clear path. And there, just as reported, stood a large German shepherd at the entrance to a shallow cave, his posture alert but not threatening, even from a distance. Sarah could see the dog was in distress, one leg held carefully off the ground. His breathing labored, but his eyes were clear and intelligent, assessing the approaching humans with careful scrutiny. "That's Guardian," she told her team. "Move slowly. Let him see we're not a threat." As they approached, Sarah caught her first glimpse of movement inside the cave, a small blonde head peering out from behind the dog's protective stance. Then another, and a third. 3 identical faces, sunburned and dirty, but unmistakably alive. The triplets had survived the desert night, protected by their faithful guardian. But their ordeal wasn't over yet. Blackwell's men were still out there. Thomas Anderson was being intercepted by law enforcement, and Martha Johnson was about to discover that the children from her vision were the grandchildren she had never known. And Guardian, standing his ground despite pain and exhaustion, was facing the greatest test of his loyalty, determining which of these approaching strangers could be trusted with his precious charges. The sandstorm appeared without warning, a distant brown wall sweeping across the desert floor with frightening speed. Detective Sarah Reynolds had seen desert storms before, but never one that materialized so suddenly or moved so quickly. One moment, the sky was clear blue. The next, a churning mass of dust and debris raced toward them, obscuring everything in its path. "Everyone, take cover," she shouted to her team, already backing toward the cave where Guardian stood with the triplets. "We need to get the children to shelter now." The German shepherd seemed to understand the approaching danger. Despite his injury, he moved with renewed purpose, herding the little girls deeper into the shallow cave. Sarah and the paramedic reached the entrance just as the first gusts of wind hit, carrying stinging particles of sand that felt like needles against exposed skin. "Hello there," Sarah said gently, kneeling at the cave entrance to appear less threatening to both dog and children.
"My name is Detective Reynolds. We're here to help you."
3 identical pairs of blue eyes regarded her with caution from behind Guardian's protective form. The shepherd hadn't relaxed his vigilant stance, though he made no move to prevent Sarah from entering the shelter. He was assessing, evaluating, determining if these newcomers represented safety or danger. It was the middle triplet, the one in the pink dress, who spoke first. "Are you taking us to Daddy?" she asked, her voice hoarse from dehydration. Sarah hesitated, unwilling to lie but equally unwilling to explain that their father was currently being detained by Sheriff Miller. "We're going to get you somewhere safe," she said instead. "But first, our friend here needs to check that you're okay." She gestured to the paramedic, who had knelt beside her with his medical kit. Guardian watched intently as the paramedic slowly opened his bag. The shepherd's military training had familiarized him with medics and their equipment. He recognized the purpose, if not the specific individual, and his posture relaxed slightly enough for the paramedic to ease past him toward the children. "Hi there," the medic said, his voice cheerful despite the howling wind outside. "I'm Sam. Can you tell me your names?" "I'm Olivia," said the triplet in blue, assuming the role of spokesperson. "That's Emma," she pointed to the one in pink. "And that's Sophie," indicating the third sister in yellow. "We're 3 years old." "That's very grown up," Sam replied, carefully checking Emma's pulse. "You must be very brave to stay out here all night." "Guardian protected us," Sophie said quietly, reaching out to touch the shepherd's fur. "He's hurt. A snake bit him," Sam nodded, continuing his examination of the children while speaking in the same calm tone. "We'll help Guardian too. Can you show me where the snake bit him?" Outside the cave, the sandstorm had reached full fury. The 2 deputies who had accompanied Sarah and Sam had barely made it to the shelter in time, and now stood at the entrance, their backs to the stinging wind, creating a human barrier against the worst of the storm. Sarah's radio crackled with static before Sheriff Miller's voice broke through. "Reynolds, do you copy?" She pressed the talk button. "I copy. Sheriff, we've reached the children, all 3 alive, dehydrated but stable. The dog is injured snakebite, according to the children. We're sheltering from the storm. What's your status?" "We've got Anderson. He surrendered without incident when we explained we'd found his daughters. We're taking shelter in a rock outcropping about half a mile southeast of your position." Sarah felt a wave of relief. At least they wouldn't have to deal with a desperate father attempting to reach his children during a sandstorm. "Any word on our other searcher, Martha Johnson?" There was a pause before Miller responded, his voice tight with concern. "Negative. Last visual from the helicopter before it had to retreat showed her about a quarter-mile from your position, moving northwest. Then the storm hit. We've lost visual." Sarah closed her eyes briefly, imagining the elderly woman caught in the open during the sandstorm. Martha was experienced in desert survival, but this storm had materialized with unusual speed, catching even the search team by surprise. "We'll keep an eye out," she promised. "How long is this storm expected to last?" "Weather Service says it could blow through in an hour, or it could stall and last into the evening. No way to predict. Sit tight and keep the children safe. We'll regroup when it passes." As Sarah returned the radio to her belt, she noticed Guardian had moved to the cave entrance, his attention fixed on the swirling sand outside despite the obvious pain in his injured leg. His behavior reminded her of her partner's search dog, who would sometimes alert to things humans couldn't yet perceive. "What is it, boy?" she asked quietly, moving to stand beside him. Guardian gave no indication he'd heard her, his focus unwavering. Then, to Sarah's surprise, Sophie appeared at her side, the quietest Triplet's expression solemn as she too stared into the storm. "Someone's coming," the little girl announced with absolute certainty. Sarah peered into the maelstrom of sand and dust, seeing nothing but the occasional shadowy outline of desert vegetation being whipped by the wind. "I don't see anyone, sweetheart." Sophie simply pointed, her small finger indicating a direction rather than a visible presence. "There. Guardian knows." Before Sarah could respond, the shepherd suddenly bolted from the cave, disappearing into the swirling sand with startling speed, despite his injury. "Guardian!" Olivia cried out in alarm, attempting to follow before Sarah caught her gently by the shoulders. "Stay here," the detective instructed firmly. "It's not safe out there." One of the deputies unclipped his flashlight, preparing to follow the dog. But Sarah shook her head. "We can't risk getting separated in this. The children are our priority." Inside the cave, Sam had finished his initial assessment of the triplets. "They're dehydrated and sunburned, but remarkably stable," he reported quietly to Sarah. "It's amazing they survived the night with no serious issues. That dog must have found them water." Sarah nodded, remembering the spring mentioned in Martha's description of this area. Guardian had not only protected the children from predators, but had also led them to water the difference between life and death in the desert. "What about the dog's snake bite?" she asked. Sam frowned. "Without seeing it, I can't say for sure. But if it happened yesterday and he's still mobile, it might not have been a lethal dose. Still, he needs treatment soon." Outside, the wind momentarily diminished, creating a brief pocket of visibility. Sarah stepped cautiously to the cave entrance, peering into the storm. For a moment, she thought she saw movement, a dark shape moving purposefully through the swirling sand. Then the wind increased again, and whatever she'd glimpsed vanished into the beige murk. 10 minutes passed with no sign of Guardian. The triplets huddled together on a blanket provided by Sam, sipping carefully from water bottles, their eyes fixed on the cave entrance with worried expressions. "He'll come back," Emma said with childish confidence. "Guardian always comes back." As if summoned by her faith, a shape appeared at the entrance, but it wasn't Guardian alone. The German shepherd limped slowly into the cave, and beside him walked an elderly woman, her clothes covered in dust, a colorful scarf wrapped around her face against the stinging sand. Martha Johnson had found them, or more accurately, Guardian had found Martha. The shepherd guided the older woman to the children before collapsing beside them, his energy finally spent. Martha unwound the scarf from her face, revealing weathered features and piercing dark eyes that moved with wonder over the three identical faces before her. "My God," she whispered. "Caroline's eyes." Sarah stepped forward. "Martha Johnson, I'm Detective Sarah Reynolds. Are you hurt?" Martha shook her head, unable to look away from the triplets. "I got turned around in the storm. Would have been in real trouble if this brave fellow hadn't found me."
She gestured to Guardian, who lay panting on the cave floor, his eyes half closed with exhaustion. Olivia had been studying the newcomer with the intensity only a child can manage. "Who are you?" she asked directly. Martha knelt slowly, her old knees protesting the movement. "My name is Martha. I believe—" She paused, her voice catching. "I believe I'm your grandmother." A mile away, Thomas Anderson sat in Sheriff Miller's SUV, handcuffed but cooperative. Through the vehicle's dust-covered windows, he could see little of the surrounding desert, but his thoughts were fixed on his daughters, wondering if they had survived the night, if Guardian had protected them, if they would ever forgive him for what he had done. "My girls," he said suddenly, breaking the tense silence. "Are they really okay?" Sheriff Miller, who had been updating his department via radio, glanced at Thomas with a mixture of professional detachment and personal disgust. "According to Detective Reynolds, they're dehydrated but stable. Your dog protected them." Thomas closed his eyes, a tear escaping despite his effort to maintain composure. "Guardian," he whispered. "Good boy." "Want to tell me why a successful real estate developer abandons his 3-year-old daughters in the desert?" Miller asked, his tone conversational despite the severity of the question. Thomas opened his eyes, meeting the sheriff's gaze directly. "I made a deal with the devil," he said simply. "And when he came to collect, I had to choose between bad and worse. Victor Blackwell," Miller stated rather than asked. Thomas nodded. "I owed him money. A lot of money. He threatened to—" He couldn't finish the sentence, the horror of Blackwell's threats still too raw. "So you chose to leave them in the desert rather than turn them over to him," Miller concluded. "Some might call that cold calculation. Others might call it a desperate attempt to give them a chance." "I knew Guardian would stay with them," Thomas said quietly. "He's a retired military dog, trained for desert conditions. I prayed someone would find them before—" He trailed off again. The sheriff studied him for a moment. "Your prayer was answered, but you're still facing charges." Thomas nodded, accepting this reality. "I deserve whatever punishment comes. But Blackwell, he's still out there, still a threat to my daughters." "We're working on that," Miller assured him. "Your information has been helpful, but right now, the best thing you can do for your girls is cooperate fully and tell us everything you know about Blackwell's operation." Inside the cave, Martha Johnson had taken over tending to Guardian while Sam continued monitoring the triplets. The elderly woman worked with quiet efficiency,
cleaning the snakebite with supplies from her pack and applying a poultice made from desert plants she had gathered during her search. "Old Navajo remedy," she explained to Sarah, who watched with skeptical interest. "Won't replace proper veterinary care, but it'll help draw out what venom remains and ease the pain." Guardian submitted to her ministrations with surprising trust, as though recognizing a kindred spirit, another protector who understood the desert and its ways. The triplets watched from their blanket, still sipping water under Sam's careful supervision. Their initial wariness of Martha had given way to curiosity, especially after her claim of being their grandmother. "Did you know our mommy?" Sophie asked, breaking her usual quiet reserve. Martha's hands stilled momentarily on Guardian's leg. "Yes, sweetheart. Caroline was my daughter, your mother. Daddy says Mommy is in heaven," Emma offered. "She died when we were born." Martha nodded, blinking back tears. "That's right. I didn't get to say goodbye to her. We had a disagreement many years ago and lost touch. I didn't even know she had given me 3 beautiful granddaughters." "That's sad," Olivia declared with a child's direct honesty. "Daddy gets sad about Mommy, too. Sometimes he cries when he thinks we're sleeping." Martha resumed her work on Guardian's leg, using the activity to mask her emotional response. "I'm sure he does, little one. Your mother was very special." Sarah, who had been monitoring the storm from the cave entrance, turned back to the group. "The wind is starting to die down. Visibility is improving. Once the paramedic clears the children for travel, we'll evacuate to the nearest medical facility." "What about Guardian?" Sophie asked immediately, her concern evident. "He needs a doctor, too." "And what about Daddy?" Emma added, her lower lip trembling. Sarah exchanged a glance with Sam, unsure how to explain the complicated situation to 3-year-olds. Martha saved her from having to answer. "Guardian will get the best veterinary care," the older woman assured Sophie. "And your father?" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Your father made a mistake, but he loves you very much. The police need to talk to him about that mistake." This seemed to satisfy the children, at least temporarily. Sarah marveled at Martha's natural ability to communicate with the triplets, a grandmother's instinct. Perhaps, even after decades of separation from her own daughter. As the storm continued to abate, Guardian suddenly raised his head, ears pricked forward in alert attention. A low growl rumbled in his chest, drawing everyone's focus to the cave entrance. "What is it, boy?" Sarah asked, her hand moving instinctively toward her service weapon. The shepherd struggled to his feet despite Martha's gentle attempt to keep him still. His posture had changed completely, no longer exhausted, but tensed for action. Hackles raised, teeth partially bared. "Someone's coming," Sophie said again, her quiet voice somehow carrying over the diminishing wind. "Bad people," Sarah signaled to the deputies, who immediately moved to defensive positions. "Stay with the children," she instructed Sam and Martha, drawing her weapon as she approached the cave entrance. Through the thinning veil of dust, she could make out 2 figures approaching from the southeast, men moving with purpose, dressed in dark clothing that stood out against the desert landscape. Each carried what appeared to be a rifle. "Sheriff," she spoke urgently into her radio, "we have 2 armed individuals approaching our position from your direction. Confirm if they're yours." Miller's response was immediate and alarming. "Negative. All our personnel are accounted for. Possible Blackwell's men. We're mobilizing. But help would arrive too late. The men were already within 50 yards of the cave, their weapons clearly visible now. Sarah had only 2 deputies with her, limited cover, and 5 civilians to protect 3 children, an elderly woman, and a wounded dog. Guardian, however, had already made his assessment of the threat. Despite his injury and exhaustion, the shepherd moved to stand beside Sarah at the cave entrance, his posture communicating a clear message to reach those under his protection. These intruders would have to go through him first. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test Guardian's courage and loyalty to its absolute limit, a final stand to protect the children he had watched over from the moment Thomas Anderson made the most terrible choice of his life. "Get the children to the back of the cave," Sarah instructed Martha and Sam, her voice low and steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Years of police training had prepared her for situations like this, though never with such vulnerable civilians under her protection. Martha gathered the triplets quickly, her weathered hands gentle but firm as she guided them deeper into the shallow cave. "Come, little ones," she murmured. "We need to play a quiet game now." "But, Guardian," Sophie began, her eyes fixed on the shepherd still standing beside Detective Reynolds at the entrance. "Guardian is doing his job," Martha explained softly. "Our job is to stay safe and quiet." Sam positioned himself between the children and the cave entrance, his medical bag repurposed as a makeshift shield. It wouldn't stop a bullet, but the gesture spoke volumes about his character. Outside, the 2 armed men continued their approach, apparently unaware they had been spotted through the diminishing sandstorm. Sarah and her deputies used the cave's natural rock formation for cover, weapons drawn, but held low to avoid immediate escalation. "Sheriff, what's your ETA?" Sarah whispered into her radio. Miller's response was clipped with tension. 10 minutes minimum. Terrain's slowing us down. What's your situation? 2 armed subjects approaching, approximately 40 yards out now. Weapons appear to be hunting rifles. No visual confirmation, but likely Blackwell's men based on their approach vector and behavior. Hold position if possible. Do not engage unless threatened. Backup is coming. Sarah knew hold position was easy to say from half a mile away. The reality of their situation was far more precarious. The cave offered limited protection, with only one exit currently being approached by armed hostiles. If these men had been sent to clean up Blackwell's loose ends, they wouldn't hesitate to eliminate witnesses, even children. Guardian seemed to understand the gravity of their situation. Despite his injured leg and the obvious pain it caused him, the shepherd remained vigilantly focused on the approaching threat, his body tense but controlled. Sarah had worked with police dogs before, but never one that displayed such clear situational awareness without handler commands. "Good boy," she whispered, and the shepherd's ear twitched slightly in acknowledgement. The men were close enough now that Sarah could make out their features through the settling dust-hard faces. Expressionless eyes scanning the terrain with practiced efficiency. They moved like professionals, maintaining distance from each other to avoid presenting a single target, using natural cover when available. Not common criminals. Then, something worse.
"That's the cave," the taller man said, his voice carrying clearly in the post-storm stillness.
"Blackwell says clean sweep. No witnesses." Sarah felt cold dread settle in her stomach at the casual discussion of murder. These men had come to kill 3 children and anyone protecting them. with no more emotion than if they'd been sent to clear trash. "I count 2 deputies at the entrance," the second man observed. "Maybe more inside. This just got complicated. Blackwell's paying triple for this job. Complicated just means we earn it." Sarah had heard enough. These men weren't going to back down, and help was still minutes away. She needed to act now, while she still had the element of partial surprise. "Police officers," she called out, her voice commanding, "drop your weapons and put your hands where I can see them." The men reacted instantly, diving for cover behind nearby rocks. A shot rang out, the bullet striking the cave entrance inches from Sarah's position, sending rock fragments flying. "We have children in here," she shouted, hoping to appeal to whatever humanity these men might possess. The response was another shot, closer this time. These weren't men who would be swayed by the presence of innocent children. They had come to eliminate evidence, and they would complete their task regardless of who stood in their way. Inside the cave, Martha held the triplets close, trying to shield them from both the sounds of gunfire and the reality of their situation. Emma had begun to cry softly, her small body trembling with fear. Olivia, ever the protector, had her arms around both sisters, her young face set in a determined expression beyond her years. Sophie remained eerily calm, her eyes fixed on Guardian's silhouette at the cave entrance. "It's okay," Martha whispered, though she knew it was a lie. "Everything will be okay." At the entrance, Sarah and her deputies exchanged fire with the gunmen, the confined space of the canyon amplifying each shot into a thunderous roar. Guardian remained beside Sarah, neither cowering from the noise nor rushing foolishly into danger. He seemed to be waiting, assessing, his military training evident in his disciplined patience. The standoff continued for several tense minutes, neither side gaining advantage. The deputies were limited by their need to protect the cave entrance, while the gunmen were constrained by their cover positions. It was a deadly stalemate that could only be broken by the arrival of reinforcements or a desperate move by either side. That move came suddenly and unexpectedly. "I see movement to the east," one of the deputies warned. "We've got a third hostile approaching." Sarah risked a quick glance in the indicated direction and felt her blood freeze. A third man had indeed appeared, working his way around their flank. But what chilled her was his position. He had climbed above the cave, finding a route that would allow him to fire down into their shelter from an angle they couldn't defend against. Before she could reposition, Guardian made his decision. With a powerful surge of muscle, the shepherd bolted from the cave entrance, a tan blur of focused aggression heading directly toward the flanking gunman. The man barely had time to register the approaching threat before Guardian launched himself into the air, a perfectly executed attack that he had performed countless times during his military service. His jaws closed around the gunman's weapon arm with bone-crushing force, the momentum of his leap taking both dog and man to the ground in a cloud of dust and startled shouts. The rifle discharged harmlessly into the air as Guardian maintained his grip, growling deeply as the man screamed in pain and surprise. The distraction was all Sarah and her deputies needed. With coordinated precision, they used the moment to advance on the remaining gunmen, calling out commands and forcing them to divide their attention between the new threat from the deputies and their colleagues' cries for help. "Drop your weapons," Sarah ordered again, using a boulder for cover as she moved forward. Last chance. One of the gunmen apparently decided the job wasn't worth dying for. He threw down his rifle and raised his hands. The other hesitated, then swung his weapon toward the cave entrance in a last desperate attempt to complete his assignment. 3 shots rang out simultaneously, 2 from the deputies and 1 from a new direction entirely. The gunman crumpled to the ground, his unfired rifle falling beside him. Sheriff Miller stepped into view from behind a rock formation, his service weapon still raised. "Clear," he called out. "Reynolds, status. 2 subjects down, 1 surrendered." Sarah reported, maintaining her aim on the man with raised hands.
"1 deputy checking the cave, 1 securing the prisoner. No injuries on our side." But that wasn't entirely accurate, as she discovered when she turned back toward where Guardian had tackled the 3rd gunman. The shepherd had released his hold and was now standing unsteadily over the subdued man, who clutched his savaged arm and moaned in pain. Guardian's injured leg had finally given out, and he swayed dangerously, his fur matted with fresh blood that didn't belong to the gunman. "Guardian's hit!" she called out, rushing toward the shepherd as he collapsed onto his side, his breathing labored and shallow. Inside the cave, Sophie suddenly stiffened in Martha's arms. "Guardian," she whispered, her voice breaking. Without warning, the quietest Triplet broke free from her grandmother's embrace and darted toward the cave entrance before anyone could stop her. "Sophie." "No," Martha called, but the little girl was already outside, running with single-minded determination toward the fallen shepherd. Sam lunged after her, but Olivia and Emma were already following their sister, the triplets moving with the synchronized purpose that sometimes made multiple births seem almost supernatural in their connection. Martha struggled to her feet, her old joints protesting the sudden movement, and followed the children out of the cave. The gunfire had stopped, but the danger wasn't necessarily over. Still, she wouldn't let her newly discovered grandchildren face it alone. Outside, the scene that greeted her was both chaotic and strangely ordered. Sheriff Miller and his deputies had secured the area, disarming and restraining the surviving gunman. Detective Reynolds knelt beside Guardian, her hands pressed against his side where blood seeped through his tan fur. And running toward them, 3 small figures in dust-covered dresses, blue, pink, and yellow, their identical faces set with the same expression of desperate concern. "Guardian," Sophie cried, reaching the shepherd first and falling to her knees beside his head. Her small hands gently stroked his muzzle as tears streamed down her sunburned cheeks. "Wake up, Guardian. Please wake up." Olivia and Emma joined her, forming a protective circle around their fallen protector. "He saved us," Olivia told Sarah, her voice trembling but determined. "You have to save him now." Sarah looked up at Sam, who had arrived breathless behind the children. "The bullet went through his shoulder," she reported. "I'm applying pressure. But he's lost a lot of blood, and the snake bite has weakened him considerably." Sam knelt to examine the wound, his trained hands gentle but efficient. "He needs immediate veterinary care," he concluded. The bullet missed anything immediately fatal, but between this and the snake bite, he didn't need to finish the sentence. Guardian's chances were slim, and everyone knew it. Martha joined the group, her weathered face lined with concern as she observed the shepherd's labored breathing. "There's a veterinary clinic in Wilson's Crossing," she said. "About 30 minutes by road. Dr. Wilson treats both domestic and wild animals. If anyone can help this brave boy, it's him." Sheriff Miller,
who had approached after securing the scene, nodded decisively. "My SUV is the closest vehicle. We can transport him immediately." "I'm going with him," Sophie declared, her small hand still resting on Guardian's head. It wasn't a request, but a statement of absolute certainty. "We all are," Olivia added, with Emma nodding vigorously beside her. Martha exchanged glances with Sarah and the sheriff. All three adults recognized the futility of arguing with the triplets about this. After everything these children had endured, separating them from Guardian now would only add trauma to an already traumatic experience. "I'll take them," Martha offered. "They know me now, and they need to stay together." Before anyone could respond, a commotion from the direction where the deputies had gathered, the surviving gunman drew their attention. A man was approaching tall, disheveled, his hands cuffed before him, but his pace urgent despite the deputy escorting him. Thomas Anderson had arrived at the scene. "Daddy," Emma cried, the first to recognize him. Her initial impulse was to run to him, but she hesitated, torn between her father and the injured Guardian. Thomas stopped several feet away, his expression a complex mixture of relief, shame, and heartbreak, as he took in the scene his daughters alive, but gathered around the bleeding form of their faithful protector. "Oh, Guardian," he whispered, his voice breaking. "What have I done?" No one answered him. No answer was necessary. The evidence of his choices lay before him: 3 traumatized children and a dying dog who had given everything to protect them from the consequences of Thomas's mistakes. It was Sophie, the quiet observer, who broke the painful tableau. She looked up from Guardian to meet her father's gaze directly. "Guardian saved us," she said simply. "When you left." The words, spoken without accusation but with the devastating honesty of a child, seemed to physically strike Thomas. He flinched as though she had slapped him, tears filling his eyes. "I know, sweetheart," he managed. "I know he did. He's hurt real bad," Emma added, her voice quavering. "The bad men shot him." Thomas looked to Sheriff Miller, a silent question in his eyes. The sheriff hesitated, then nodded slightly. "Deputy, bring Mr. Anderson over here," he instructed. The deputy guided Thomas forward until he stood just a few feet from Guardian. Despite his handcuffs, Thomas managed to kneel awkwardly in the dust beside his daughters and their protector. "Guardian," he called softly. "Hey, boy." The shepherd's ears twitched at the familiar voice, and with visible effort, he raised his head slightly, amber eyes focusing on Thomas. There was no recrimination in that gaze, no judgment, only the same unwavering loyalty that had led him to leap from Thomas's car to stay with the abandoned children. "I'm so sorry," Thomas whispered, tears flowing freely now. "You did what I couldn't. You protected them when I failed." Guardian made a soft sound, neither growl nor whine, and let his head rest again on the desert floor. His breathing had become more labored, each rise and fall of his chest an obvious struggle. "We need to move him now if he's going to have any chance," Sam urged gently. Martha stepped forward then, her presence commanding attention despite her age and small stature. "Thomas Anderson," she said, her voice steady but tinged with an emotion none of them could quite identify. "I'm Martha Johnson, Carolyn's mother.
Your children's grandmother. Thomas looked up in shock, momentarily distracted from Guardian's plight. Caroline's mother, but she said you were dead, no? Estranged. Yes. And that's a conversation for another time. Martha's tone brooked no argument. Right now, this dog needs help, and these children need both their father and their protector. She turned to Sheriff Miller. Can you remove those handcuffs? At least until we get this brave animal the help he needs. I think we all understand that Thomas isn't going anywhere while his daughters and their guardian are in danger. Miller hesitated, duty warring with compassion on his weathered face. Finally, he nodded to the deputy. Remove the restraints, but Mr. Anderson remains in custody, just without the hardware for now. As the handcuffs were removed, Thomas immediately moved closer to Guardian, gently gathering the shepherd's head into his lap. "Hold on, boy," he murmured. "Just hold on. We're getting you help." The triplets pressed close, their small hands finding places to touch Guardian's fur, as if their collective will could somehow keep him tethered to life. Sam and Sheriff Miller carefully lifted the injured shepherd onto a makeshift stretcher, a deputy's jacket stretched between two rifle barrels. Guardian whimpered once at the movement, then went frighteningly still. "He's still breathing," Sam assured the anxious children. "He's very strong." They moved as a somber procession toward the sheriff's waiting SUV, Miller and Sam carrying Guardian, Thomas walking beside them with a triplet holding each of his hands, and Sophie walking ahead, her eyes never leaving Guardian's face. Martha and Sarah followed, the detective maintaining professional distance while the grandmother watched her newly discovered family with a mixture of concern and wonder. As they reached the vehicle, Thomas lifted each daughter inside before carefully helping to position Guardian across the back seat, his head cradled in Sophie's small lap. Martha climbed in beside them, while Thomas hesitated at the door. "Go," Sheriff Miller said quietly. "We'll follow with Detective Reynolds. Don't make me regret this temporary reprieve. Anderson." Thomas nodded gratefully before joining his daughters, positioning himself on the floor of the SUV where he could maintain pressure on Guardian's wound during the journey. As the vehicle pulled away, Martha observed the interaction between father and daughters with keen eyes. Despite everything that had happened, despite Thomas's unforgivable action in abandoning them, the triplets showed no fear of their father. There was wariness, yes, and confusion, but not terror. And Thomas handled them with gentle competence that spoke of years of devoted parenting before this catastrophic failure. "You've been raising them alone since Caroline died," Martha said. It wasn't a question. Thomas nodded, his eyes fixed on Guardian's labored breathing. "I have. I've tried to be both father and mother to them. Until—" He couldn't finish. "Until you made a terrible choice," Martha completed for him. "A choice you'll have to answer for." "I know." Martha's weathered hand reached out to touch his shoulder briefly. "Caroline would never have given up on you. Even when I did. She always saw the good in people, even when they couldn't see it themselves." Thomas looked up, startled by this unexpected grace from a woman who had every reason to hate him. "I don't deserve your kindness. This isn't about what you deserve," Martha replied simply.
It's about what these children need. And right now, they need both their father and their guardian to survive this ordeal. In Sophie's lap, Guardian's breathing grew increasingly shallow, each inhale a visible struggle. The little girl bent close to his ear, whispering words too soft for the adults to hear, her tears falling onto his dusty fur. Thomas watched his quietest daughter with the dying dog who had saved all three of his children, and knew with absolute certainty that regardless of what legal punishment awaited him, nothing would ever be as painful as witnessing the consequences of his actions reflected in his daughter's eyes. "Please," he whispered, though whether to God, to fate, or to Guardian himself, even he couldn't say, "Please don't let him die because of what I did." But Guardian's condition continued to deteriorate as they raced toward Wilson's Crossing, his powerful body growing increasingly still, the blood from his wounds soaking through the makeshift bandages despite Thomas's efforts. The shepherd who had stood between three abandoned children and certain death was fighting his final battle. And this time, not even his legendary courage and loyalty might be enough to ensure victory. Dr. James Wilson had been the only veterinarian in Wilson's Crossing for over 30 years. At 68, he'd seen just about everything the desert and its inhabitants could throw at him, from rattlesnake bites to mountain lion attacks. But even he paused momentarily when the bloodied German shepherd was carried into his clinic by Sheriff Miller and Thomas Anderson, followed by three identical little girls in dust-covered dresses and an elderly Navajo woman he recognized as Martha Johnson. "Exam room 1, he directed, already pulling on surgical gloves as his assistant rushed to prepare the treatment area. "What happened?" "Rattlesnake bite yesterday, gunshot wound today," Sheriff Miller explained tersely. "He's also severely dehydrated and exhausted." Dr. Wilson nodded, his experienced hands already examining Guardian as they laid him on the treatment table. "Military dog?" he asked, noting the telltale signs of specialized training in the shepherd's physique. "Yes," Thomas confirmed, his voice hoarse. "Retired. He saved my daughters." The veterinarian glanced briefly at the three small girls huddled together near the door, their identical blue eyes fixed on Guardian with an intensity that spoke volumes. He'd treated working dogs before police canines, search and rescue, even a few military returnees. He understood their value went far beyond that of a pet. "I'll do everything I can," he promised. Turning to his assistant, "Sarah, I need the snake antivenin, blood expander, broad-spectrum antibiotics, and surgical kit prepped. And please take the family to the waiting room." "No," Sophie protested, the quietest Triplet finding her voice. "I need to stay with Guardian, Doctor." Wilson had treated enough injured animals with anxious owners to know when argument was futile. The bond between this child and the shepherd was palpable, transcending ordinary pet attachment. "One of you can stay," he conceded, looking to the adults for approval. "But you'll need to be absolutely still and quiet." Martha stepped forward. "Sophie will stay with me," she said, her tone allowing no discussion. "The rest of you wait outside." Thomas hesitated, clearly torn between staying with his injured dog and caring for his other daughters. Olivia made the decision for him, tugging at his hand. "Daddy, Emma's really tired," she said, her young voice carrying the weight of responsibility beyond her years. "She needs you to hold her." The simple statement, coming from a 3-year-old who had been abandoned in the desert less than 24 hours ago, struck Thomas with the force of physical pain. His child still trusted him to provide comfort, despite everything. "Of course, sweetheart," he managed, lifting Emma into his arms as Sheriff Miller guided them to the waiting area. Inside the exam room, Dr. Wilson worked with focused intensity, his movements economical and precise as he addressed Guardian's multiple life-threatening conditions. Sophie stood silently beside Martha, both of them against the wall, well out of the way but close enough for the little girl to maintain visual contact with the shepherd. "Is Guardian going to die?" Sophie whispered to Martha, her small hand finding the older woman's weathered one. Martha considered the question with the honesty she believed children deserved. "I don't know, little one. He's very hurt, but he's also very strong, and he has something important to live for." "Us?" Sophie asked. "Yes, and the love you share. That's powerful medicine." Dr. Wilson's assistant prepared an IV line while the veterinarian cleaned the gunshot wound, his expression grave as he assessed the damage. The bullet tore through the shoulder muscle but missed the major vessels. That's the good news. The bad news is the combination of venom toxicity, dehydration, and blood loss has pushed him into shock. He glanced up at Martha and Sophie, softening his clinical assessment. "He's fighting hard, though I can see that." Sophie nodded solemnly. "Guardian never gives up. He protected us all night from the coyotes and found us water and kept us warm when it got cold." Dr. Wilson's hand stilled for a moment. "He did all that after being bitten by a rattlesnake." "Yes," Sophie confirmed. "And he got between us and the bad men with guns, too." The veterinarian exchanged a glance with Martha, who nodded slightly in confirmation of the child's account. He returned to his work with renewed determination, a new respect for his patient evident in his careful ministrations. "Well then," he said, "we'll just have to make sure all that heroism wasn't in vain, won't we?" In the waiting room, Thomas sat with Olivia and Emma on either side of him, their small bodies leaning against him with the unthinking trust of children seeking comfort from a parent. Detective Reynolds had arrived with another deputy, but maintained a respectful distance, allowing the family this moment of fragile peace before the inevitable legal proceedings began. "Daddy?" Emma said suddenly, breaking the tense silence. "Why did you leave us in the desert?" The simple question, asked without accusation but with genuine confusion, caused everyone in the waiting room to freeze. Sheriff Miller and Detective Reynolds exchanged uncomfortable glances, while Thomas felt as though all the air had been crushed from his lungs. "How did you explain to a 3-year-old that you had abandoned her and her sisters because you believed it gave them a better chance of survival than the alternative? How could any explanation possibly make sense to a child who had trusted her father absolutely?" Thomas took a shuddering breath, knowing he owed his daughters the truth, however inadequately expressed. "I made a terrible mistake, Emma. I got involved with some very bad people, and I owed them money I couldn't pay back. They threatened to hurt you and your sisters if I didn't do what they wanted." "The bad men who shot Guardian?" Olivia asked, her perception startling in one so young. Thomas nodded. "Yes, I thought if I left you in the desert with Guardian, someone would find you before anything worse happened. I was trying to protect you, but I did it in the worst possible way." He was crying now, tears falling unchecked as he confronted the horror of his actions through his children's eyes. I was wrong, so wrong, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to make it up to you, even though I know I never really can. Emma considered this with the solemnity only a child can bring to such a moment. But Guardian stayed with us, she said finally. He didn't leave. The simple statement, delivered without the intent to wound, nevertheless cut Thomas to his core. A dog had shown more courage and loyalty than he had. Yes, he whispered. Guardian stayed. He's a much better protector than I was. He's family, Olivia declared with certainty. And family doesn't leave family. From the mouth of babes, Thomas thought. Another wave of shame washing over him. His daughters, not even 4 years old, understood a fundamental truth that he had forgotten in his desperation and fear. Sheriff Miller, who had been listening to this exchange with carefully controlled emotion, cleared his throat. Your daughters are remarkably resilient. Anderson, you should be proud of how they handled themselves out there. I am, Thomas said quietly, but I can't take credit for their strength. That's all their mother and their own spirits. The door to the exam room opened then, and Dr. Wilson emerged. Removing his surgical gloves, his expression gave nothing away as he approached the anxious family. Guardian is stable for now, he announced, and Thomas felt his daughters' bodies relax against him in simultaneous relief. The next 24 hours will be critical, but I've administered antivenin, antibiotics, and blood expanders. I've repaired the muscle damage from the gunshot wound, and we're providing supportive care for the dehydration and exhaustion. So he's going to be okay? Emma asked hopefully. Dr. Wilson smiled gently at her. He's not out of danger yet, but he's responding better than I expected. Your dog is a fighter. Young lady, can we see him? Olivia requested. He's sedated right now, but yes, you can look in on him briefly. Just remember to be very quiet. The triplets immediately slid from their seats, moving as one toward the exam room door where Sophie was already waiting, her expression solemn but relieved. Martha stood beside her, one hand resting protectively on the child's shoulder. Thomas rose to follow his daughters, but hesitated, looking to Sheriff Miller for permission. The sheriff nodded slightly, his expression a complex mixture of official duty and human compassion. Inside the treatment area, Guardian lay on a padded table, multiple tubes and monitors connected to his still form. His chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm, no longer the labored breathing of their desperate journey to the clinic. The triplets approached cautiously, forming a semicircle around their protector. Sophie, who had remained during the treatment, took the lead in showing her sisters where they could touch Guardian without disturbing the medical equipment. Dr. Wilson says he can hear us, even though he's sleeping, she informed them. I've been telling him he needs to get better, so we can all go home. Home, Thomas repeated softly, the word carrying a weight of uncertainty now. Where was home for his daughters, when their father faced criminal charges and their house might be lost to his debts? Martha, standing beside him, seemed to read his thoughts. They'll have a home, she said quietly, with me, if necessary, until your situation is resolved. Thomas turned to her in surprise. You would do that? After what I did, I'm doing it for them. And for Caroline, Martha replied, her voice matter-of-fact. And because everyone deserves a chance at redemption. Even you, Thomas Anderson. Before he could respond, Detective Reynolds appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Anderson," she said formally, "I need to speak with you outside." Thomas nodded, bending to kiss each of his daughters on the forehead before following the detective back to the waiting area. He knew what was coming: the formal arrest, the reading of his rights, the beginning of legal proceedings that would determine his fate. What he didn't expect was the news Reynolds delivered once they were seated. "Victor Blackwell is dead," she stated without preamble. Apparently, when his men failed to report in after the desert operation, he attempted to flee the country. There was a confrontation with federal agents at a private airfield. He chose to resist arrest. Thomas absorbed this information, feeling neither joy nor sorrow at the death of the man who had driven him to the unthinkable, and his organization being dismantled as we speak. Your information was invaluable in identifying key players and locations. The U.S. Attorney is very interested in your continued cooperation. Hope flickered briefly in Thomas's chest before reality reasserted itself. But I'm still facing charges for child endangerment. At minimum. Reynolds nodded, her expression professional but not unkind. Yes. What you did was criminal, regardless of the circumstances that led to it. However, your cooperation, the extreme duress you were under, and the fact that you arranged for your dog to remain with the children will all be taken into consideration. She leaned forward slightly. I can't make promises, Mr. Anderson, but there's a significant difference between a father who abandons his children to die and one who makes a terrible choice while trying to protect them from an even worse fate. 6 months later, the desert bloomed in a rare spring display, wildflowers carpeting the normally austere landscape in vibrant color. Martha Johnson stood on her porch, watching as 3 identical little girls played in the yard with a German shepherd whose limp was barely noticeable now. Guardian moved with the watchful attention of a working dog, always positioning himself between potential dangers and his charges, even in this peaceful setting. The physical scars of his ordeal had healed, though he would always carry the marks of his loyalty, a stiffness in his previously injured leg, a patch of fur that grew white instead of tan where the bullet had torn through muscle. The psychological scars had healed too, for both dog and children. The triplets no longer woke screaming from nightmares of abandonment and thirst. Guardian no longer startled at sudden movements or became agitated when the girls were out of his sight. Time and love had worked their quiet magic on all of them. "Grandma," Olivia called, waving from where she had climbed onto a sturdy low branch of the mesquite tree. "Look how high I am." "I see you, sweetheart," Martha replied, smiling at the confidence that had replaced fear in her granddaughter's demeanor. "Be careful now." The sound of tires on gravel drew Guardian's attention, his ears perking forward as a sheriff's department SUV approached the house. The shepherd didn't growl or show alarm. Instead, his tail began to wag in recognition. Sheriff Miller stepped from the vehicle, followed by another man, Thomas Anderson, dressed not in prison garb, but in simple jeans and a button-down shirt. "Daddy!" the triplets cried in unison, abandoning their play to rush toward their father. Guardian loped alongside them, his previous injuries forgotten in the excitement of the moment. Thomas knelt to embrace his daughters, gathering all three into his arms at once, his eyes closed in an expression of profound gratitude. Guardian circled the group, tail wagging furiously, before pushing his muzzle into the family embrace. "You're home early?" Emma exclaimed, touching her father's face as if to confirm he was really there.
"Sheriff Miller picked me up," Thomas explained, rising with Sophie in his arms while Olivia and Emma each claimed a hand.
"I have some good news to share." Martha descended the porch steps, nodding a greeting to Sheriff Miller before addressing her son-in-law. "Your community service assignment is complete." Thomas nodded, his expression reflecting the journey of the past 6 months from despair through accountability to cautious hope. The plea agreement negotiated by his attorney had acknowledged both the severity of his actions and the extraordinary circumstances surrounding them. 2 years of house arrest, 5 years of probation, 1,000 hours of community service, and mandatory counseling, a sentence that allowed him to remain present in his daughters' lives while still answering for his crime. "As of today," he confirmed, "and the therapy program for families in crisis that I've been developing has been approved for funding. I'll be directing it as part of my ongoing community service." Martha nodded with approval. She had watched Thomas work tirelessly to rebuild what his desperate choice had shattered: his daughter's trust, his own self-respect, and his place in a community that had initially judged him harshly. It hadn't been easy. Nothing worthwhile ever was. "Caroline would be proud," she said simply, the words carrying more weight than elaborate praise. Thomas's eyes filled with tears, as they often did at the mention of his late wife. "I hope so," he whispered. Sheriff Miller, who had maintained a professional but supportive relationship with the family throughout the legal proceedings, cleared his throat. "I have something for Guardian, if that's all right." At the sound of his name, the shepherd approached the sheriff, posture attentive, but relaxed. Miller knelt to the dog's level, removing something from his pocket, a specially designed collar medal, inscribed with words too small for Martha to read from where she stood. "The department wanted to recognize Guardian's service," Miller explained as he attached the medal to the shepherd's collar. "It's the K9 Medal of Valor. We've never awarded it to a civilian dog before, but the review board was unanimous." Guardian accepted the medal with the dignity that characterized everything he did, neither preening nor withdrawing from the attention. Sophie knelt beside him, examining the medal with delicate fingers. "What does it say?" she asked, tracing the inscription. "It says, 'For exceptional courage and loyalty beyond the call of duty.'" Miller read, "And the date of your rescue." "Guardian is a hero," Emma declared proudly. "The best hero," Olivia agreed. Thomas watched his daughters with their faithful protector, the dog who had done what he could not stand, unwavering in the face of danger, putting their safety above his own survival. The shepherd had shown him what true courage looked like, not through judgment but through example. "We have another surprise," Thomas said, gathering his family's attention. "If Grandma Martha agrees, we'd like to move back into our own house." The girls looked to their grandmother with a mixture of excitement and uncertainty. They had thrived in Martha's care during their father's legal proceedings, finding in her home the stability they needed to heal from their trauma. Martha considered the proposal, her weathered face revealing nothing of her internal thoughts. Finally, she nodded,
but with a qualification. On one condition. I come with you. Thomas blinked in surprise. You'd leave your home, the place you've lived for 40 years. Home isn't a place, Martha replied, echoing words she had spoken many times during the family's healing journey. Home is the people you love, and who love you in return. My home is with my grandchildren now, and with you, if you'll have this old woman underfoot. Yes, the triplets cheered. The matter settled in their minds regardless of adult complications. Thomas extended his hand to his mother-in-law, the woman who had every reason to despise him, but had instead shown him the power of forgiveness. We would be honored. As they sealed their agreement with a handshake that became an embrace, Guardian circled the family group, his posture conveying the contentment of a working dog whose flock is safe and united. The shepherd, who had once stood alone between 3 abandoned children and certain death, now stood watch over a family reborn from the ashes of terrible choices and remarkable courage. Later that evening, as Martha prepared dinner in her kitchen for the last time, she paused to watch through the window as Thomas sat on the porch steps with his daughters and their guardian. He was reading them a story, the familiar ritual restored after months of supervised visitation and gradual trust-building. Guardian lay at their feet, his amber eyes occasionally scanning the desert beyond the yard, not with fear or hypervigilance, but with the quiet confidence of a protector who had faced the worst and prevailed. Martha thought of her daughter Caroline, lost too soon to fully know the beautiful girls she had brought into the world. "You would be proud of them all," she whispered to her absent child. "Even Thomas, in the end, he's finding his way back." Outside, the story finished. Thomas closed the book and gazed at his daughters with unmasked love. "What shall we do tomorrow?" he asked, the simple question carrying the weight of gratitude for having tomorrows with them at all. "Can we visit the spot where Guardian saved us?" Sophie asked, her quiet voice serious. "I want to leave flowers there." Thomas hesitated, pain flashing across his features at the thought of returning to the site of his greatest failure. But he nodded, understanding his daughter's need for closure. "If that's what you want, sweetheart." "I think it's important," Olivia stated with her characteristic certainty, "to remember that bad things happened. But we're okay now because Guardian never gave up on us. And because Grandma found us," Emma added. "And because Daddy came back," Thomas gathered his daughters close, unable to speak past the emotion tightening his throat. Guardian rose from his resting place to join them, pressing his solid warmth against the family group as if lending them his steadfast strength. Martha turned from the window, wiping away a tear as she returned to her cooking. Outside, the desert stretched vast and seemingly unchanging, the landscape that had nearly claimed 3 young lives now serving as the backdrop for their healing and renewal. In the yard, Guardian raised his head to the darkening sky, perhaps catching a scent on the evening breeze, or simply enjoying the cooling air after another Arizona day. The metal on his collar caught the last rays of sunlight, gleaming briefly like a star fallen to earth. Some bonds, Martha reflected as she called the family to dinner, could never be broken, not by time, not by distance, not even by the harshest desert. Guardian had proven that when he leaped from Thomas's car to stand beside 3 abandoned children, Thomas was proving it now,
rebuilding what his desperation had nearly destroyed. And the triplets proved it every day, with their remarkable capacity for love, despite betrayal. As they gathered around her table, heads bowed for grace, Martha added a silent prayer of her own gratitude for second chances, for the wisdom that comes through suffering, and for the faithful guardian who had shown them all what it meant to love without condition or limit. Guardian, settled now at Sophie's feet beneath the table, closed his amber eyes in contentment, his mission complete, his family safe, his loyalty rewarded with the only payment that had ever mattered to him, the love of those he had been born to protect. In the heart of Arizona's unforgiving desert, a tale of extraordinary devotion unfolded when a German shepherd named Guardian refused to abandon 3 little girls left behind by their desperate father. This story reminds us that sometimes our darkest moments can lead to unexpected blessings. Martha found grandchildren she never knew existed. Thomas discovered the true meaning of redemption through accountability. And the triplets learned that family extends beyond blood to those who stand by us when others walk away. Like Guardian, who faced rattlesnakes, gunmen, and his own injuries to protect those he loved, we too can find strength we never knew we possessed when protecting those who matter most. Life offers second chances to those brave enough to accept responsibility for their mistakes and work tirelessly to make amends. No matter our age, we can build new connections, heal old wounds, and create families bound by love rather than obligation. What faithful companion has shown you unconditional love when you needed it most? Or when have you, like Martha, opened your heart to forgiveness and found unexpected joy? Share your stories of loyalty and second chances. In the comments below, your wisdom might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.